Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are finishing up our Industrial Revolution unit. I mean, it was quick, it was fast, and for us, it's going to end, but some people still say the Industrial Revolution is still going on today. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into this lecture. Share my screen. So along with the Industrial Revolution comes this new form of mass culture, is what you could call it, mass society. And basically what we have today stems from this time period way back when. So the emergence of mass society, chapter 6, lesson 2. That was your warm-up. Okay, objectives. We're going to identify causes and effects of urbanization in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Understand the structure of European society in the late 1800s and understand the causes and effects of increased levels of education in the 19th century. So, city conditions. They were not great. So, with the emergence of mass society, governments now had to consider how to appeal to the masses rather than just to whether the citizens. Housing and public sanitation in the cities were two areas of great concern. With few jobs available in the countryside, people from rural areas migrated to cities to find work in the factories, and as a result, more and more people lived in cities. In the 1850s, urban dwellers made about 40% of the English population, 15% in France, 10 in Prussia, and 5 in Russia. 40 years passes. In 1890, urban dwellers now had 60% in England, 25 in France, 30 in Prussia, 10 in Russia. In industrialized nations, cities grew tremendously. For example, from 1800 to 1900, the population of London grew from just under 1 million people to 6.5 million people. So almost 6 million more people living in London in the span of 100 years. That's population growth. Cities grew faster in the second half of the 19th century because of improvements in public health and sanitation. Improvements came in the 1840s after a number of urban reformers urged local governments to do something about the filthy living conditions that caused deadly in cities like cholera or drinking unclean water. Cholera, not good. On the advice of reformers, city governments now created boards of health to improve housing quality. City medical officers and building inspectors were authorized to inspect dwellings for public health hazards. Regulations required running water, internal drainage systems for new buildings. So clean water and an effective sewage system were critical to the public health. The need for fresh water was not met by a system of dams and reservoirs. You had tunnels and aqueducts will then carry water from the countryside to the city and into homes. Gas and electric heaters made regular hot baths possible, and the treatment of sewage was improved by building underground pipes that carried raw sewage from the city for disposal, far from the city for disposal. A public campaign in Frankfurt, Germany, featured a sign that said, "From the toilet to the river in half an hour." That's fun. I now know my sewage is going into the river. So here's some migration. All right, society described. After 1871, most people enjoyed a higher standard of living, but still the disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest members of society grew. Between the few who were rich and to the many who were poor existed several middle-class groups. At the top of European society stood the wealthy elite. We kind of already figured this out. This group made up of only 5% of the population, but controlled 30 to 40% of the wealth. Kind of sounds like the French Revolution, pre-French Revolution society. During the 1800s, the most successful industrialists, bankers, merchants, the wealthy upper middle class, had joined with the landed aristocracy, the upper class, to form this new elite. Whether aristocratic or upper middle class backgrounds, members of the elite became leaders in the government and military. Although some members of the upper middle class became part of the new elite, the rest of the middle class consisted of several groups at varying economic social levels. Below the upper middle class was a middle group that included lawyers, doctors, members of civil service, business managers, engineers, architects, accountants, and chemists. Beneath this solid and comfortable middle group was a lower middle class of small shopkeepers, traders, and prosperous farmers. The Second Industrial Revolution produced a new group of white-collar workers between the lower middle class and the lower classes. This group included traveling salespeople, bookkeepers, telephone operators, department store salespeople, and secretaries. Although not highly paid, these white-collar workers were often committed to middle-class ideals. The middle classes shared a certain lifestyle with values that dominated much of 19th century society. The European middle classes believed in hard work, which was open to everyone and guaranteed positive results. Outward appearances were also important to the middle classes. The etiquette book, The Habits of Good Society, was a bestseller. So you got landowners or aristocrats, you got the middle class, and you got the working class, who we're going to talk about right now. The working class below the middle classes in the social scale were the working classes, also referred to as the lower classes, which made up of almost 80% of the European population. Many in the working class had found employment as wage laborers in factories, mills, and other industrial centers. As industrial machinery became more complex and expensive to purchase and to maintain, wage labor often remained the only reasonable employment option for the vast majority of the urban working class. This resulted in greater inequality as factory owners benefited from larger and larger profits while continuing to pay lower and lower wages for their employees. The urban working class consisted of many different groups. They might be skilled artisans or semi-skilled laborers, but many were still unskilled day laborers or domestic servants. In Britain, 1900, 1 out of every 7 employed persons was a domestic servant, and servants were mostly women. After 1870, workers in urban areas began to live more comfortably. Reforms created better living conditions in cities. In addition, a rise in wages, along with the decline in many consumer costs, made it possible for workers to buy extra clothes or to pay to entertain themselves in their few leisure hours. Many of these gains had to come through efforts of strikes and labor organizing. With these methods, workers had won better wages, a 10-hour workday, and a Saturday afternoon off. The benefits of industrial society, electricity, sanitation, and the use of powered machinery was mostly unknown to the rural working classes. These classes included landholding peasants, farm laborers, and sharecroppers. Human and animal energy, usually in the form of draft animals like horses or oxen, remained the primary means of production for these working class farmers. Wealthy landowners could often afford newer machinery powered by coal or gas as they reaped the benefit of greater efficiency and larger crop yield. Most poor farmers focusing on subsistence agriculture and unable to afford these new machines could not compete. The result was an increasing inequality between the two classes of rural society. So here you got the working class. Cheap. The industrial era witnessed unprecedented levels of global migration, most of it from Europe and Asia to the United States between 1880 and 1920, 40 years. More than 20 million immigrants came to the U.S., the majority of them from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, and some from China and Japan. These immigrants left their homes to escape poverty, war, religious persecution, and restrictions in their social classes. Some were skilled in a trade and continued that practice when they arrived, but most were unskilled and found work in America's industrial cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Immigrants worked for low wages and endured harsh working conditions. If they didn't know the language, it was kind of easy to show them what they needed to do and whip them into shape when they didn't. In spite of these hardships, the economic and social opportunities they found encouraged further immigration to the United States. Immigration provided a steady supply of labor for the U.S. and allowed for a broad expansion of industry and infrastructure. Immigrants also reshaped the social fabric of America. By the 1890s, they made up a large percentage of the population of many of its major cities. They left a cultural imprint in these places in the form of native language newspapers, social clubs, churches, and synagogues. So a lot of them were coming from right here. They're called new immigrants coming to America. You got Latin American immigrants, and then you got China and Japan. Here's some immigration. Here's a bird's eye view showing about 3 square miles of central portion of the city Detroit. All right, women. We haven't really talked about women, and usually women get discarded to the back. But during this time period, women will fight for more equality. So, yay. In 1800, women were mainly defined by their families and household roles, and in the 19th century, they struggled to change their status. During much of the 19th century, working class groups maintained the belief that women should remain, at home to bear and nurture children. Middle class women were not allowed to enter the industrial workforce. The Second Industrial Revolution, however, opened the door to new jobs for women. There were not enough men to fill the relatively low paid white collar jobs that were being created. A white collar job is one typically done in an office setting, as opposed to blue collar jobs, which are most often on a factory floor. Both industrial plants and retail shops hired women as clerks, typists, secretaries, and sales clerks. The expansion of government services also created job opportunities for women. Many of these tasks were white collar jobs, like many of the new jobs in the private industry. Women took jobs in education, health, and social services. Middle class women held these jobs, but they were mainly filled by the working class. So women working, putting in the work. Happy wife, happy life. As the chief family wage earners, men worked outside the home and women were left to care for, that should be for the family, not food the family, left to take care for the family. Sorry, typos. Throughout the 1800s, marriage remained almost the only honorable and available career for most women. The number of children born to the average woman began to decline. The most significant development in the modern family. This decline was tied to the improved economic conditions and increased use of birth control. The family was the central institution to the middle class life. With fewer children in the family, mothers could devote more time to children, to childcare and domestic leisure. Middle class women were discouraged from finding paid labor or working outside the home. The home for middle class families became a kind of refuge from the dangers of the industrial world. The middle class family fostered an ideal of togetherness. The lives of working class women were different from those of the middle class counterparts. Most working women had to earn money to support their families. Their contributions made a big difference in the economic survival of their families. For the children of the working classes, childhood was over by the age of 9 or 10. And by this age, children often became apprentices or were employed in odd jobs. Between 1890 and 1914, family patterns among the working classes began to change. Higher paying jobs in heavy industry and improvements in the standard of living made it possible for working class families to depend on the incomes of husbands alone. By the 20th century, some working class mothers could afford to stay at home, following the pattern of middle class women. At the same time, working class families aspired to buy new consumer products such as sewing machines and cast iron stoves. Here's some middle class women, Victorian women. Rights. So modern feminism, or the movement for women's rights, has beginnings during the Enlightenment, Mary Wollstonecraft. At this time, some women advocated for equality for women based on the doctrine of natural rights. Enlightenment still comes up during this time period. In the 1830s, a number of women in the U.S. and Europe argued for the right of women to own property by law. Before this time, a husband had almost total control of their wife's property. These early efforts were not successful, however, as married women did not win the right to own some property until 1970. I think that's 1870 in Great Britain, 1900 in Germany, and 1907 in France. The fight for property rights was only the beginning of the women's movement. Some middle and upper middle class women argued for and gained access to universities. Others sought entry into occupations dominated by men. Although training to become doctors was largely closed to women, some entered the medical field to become nurses. The efforts of British nurse Florence Nightingale, combined with those of Clara Barton during the U.S. Civil War, transformed nursing into a profession of trained middle-class women in white. By the 1840s and 50s, the movement for women's rights expanded as women called for equal political rights. They believed that suffrage, the right to vote, was key to improving their overall position. Most of the members of the women's movement, called suffragists, had one basic aim: the right for full citizenship in the nation state. The British women's movement was the most active in Europe. The Women's Social and Political Union, founded in 1903 by Emanuel Pankhurst and her daughters, used unusual publicity stunts to call attention to its demands. Its members pelted government officials with eggs, chained themselves to lampposts, and smashed department store windows. British police often answered with arrests and brutal treatment of the leading activists. Before 1914, women had the right to vote in only a few nations, such as Norway and Finland, along with some American states. It took the upheaval of World War I to make governments give in to this basic issue. Votes for women, National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. All right, last slide. Education and leisure. Universal education was a product of mass society in the 19th century and early 20th centuries. Before that time, the education was reserved mainly for the elite and wealthier middle class. Between 1870 and 1914, most Western governments began to finance a system of primary education. Boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 12 were required to attend these schools. Why did Western nations make this commitment to public education? One reason: industrialization. In the first industrial revolution, workers without training or experience were able to meet factory needs. The new firms of the second industrial revolution needed trained, skilled workers. The chief motive for public education was political. By giving more people the right to vote, created a need for better educated voters. Even more importantly, primary schools instilled patriotism. Compulsory elementary education created a demand of teachers, and most of them were women. Many men saw teaching as a part of women's natural role of nurturers of children. Women were also paid lower salaries than men, which in itself was a strong incentive for states to set up teacher training program schools for women. The second industrial revolution allowed people to pursue new forms of leisure. Popular mass leisure both entertained large crowds and distracted them from the realities of their work lives. Leisure came to be viewed as what people could do for fun after work. The industrial system gave people new times, evening hours, weekends, and a week or two in the summer to indulge in leisure activities. Amusement parks, dance halls, and organized team sports became enjoyable ways for people to spend their leisure hours. And that's gonna do it. That's it. That's the end of that lecture. It was very short. I think we're on 14 minutes right now, 15 minutes. Okay. Your homework, I was just looking at the book. Your homework is going to be page 227, 2 through 4. 227, 2 through 4. So yeah, I mean, we're done with the Industrial Revolution. You know, we got new inventions, new machines that were invented back then. They're still around to this day, and that's why we're looking at them. So we couldn't really put this in revolutions because those were more political revolutions. Here, this was like technology, industrial, new things, new changes. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.